Book of Habakkuk chapter 3. We have reached the last chapter in the book of Habakkuk, which consists of 3 parts. The first part is an introduction to Habakkuk's prayer. It consists of the first 2 verses. The first verse serves as the title for the whole chapter. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet. On Shigionoth. The word Shigionoth did not appear in the entire Bible except twice. Once here in Habakkuk 3 and the second time in Psalm number 7, which was titled, A Shigion of David, which he sang to the Lord concerning Cush, a Benjamite. Thus, we can understand that a Shigion expresses a sad poem full of intense feelings, sung as a result of strong emotional pressure and distress, which in turn, is reflected in the manner of its singing. This is evident in either Psalm 7 or Habakkuk chapter 3. Habakkuk begins his hymn or prayer with 2 specific requests to the Lord. The first, O Lord, revive your work. In the midst of the years. In the midst of the years make it known. I mean, O Lord, the works that you can to do and are accustomed to do before with your people, do it again now. In the midst of these years, the years of captivity. Then, after this, he asks for the second request and says to him, In anger remember mercy. We cannot stand before you in your anger. And I am sure that you are merciful even when you are angry with us and punishing us. In the second part of the chapter from verses 3 to 15, Habakkuk reviews the greatness of God and his past salvation for his people in the old history of Israel. He remembers the days when God get his people out from Egypt, and brought them into the land he had promised them. And he asks the Lord to repeat these actions again, and bring them out of their humiliation and captivity in Babylon, and bring them back to their land. And in the following 13 verses, we see 13 pictures, or pictorial scenes that show God's greatness and almighty power. It begins in verse 3 which says, God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran. Here he quotes what Moses said about God in Deuteronomy 33 verse 2. When he was describing the greatness of God in the scene of giving the law. And God is depicted as if he rises like the sun from the east. On the side of Teman, which is Edom, and which Moses named in Deuteronomy chapter 33, Seir. The second country, which is also located east of Israel, is Paran. In verse 4, he completes this idea and says, His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand. But because of the intensity of the light, you cannot look at it, nor discover all of his power. That is why he said, where his power was hidden. In verse 5, he talks about 2 plagues with which the Lord struck the land of Egypt. The pestilence. It is mentioned in Exodus chapter 9 verse 9. And burning fire, according to the most accurate translations, which we find also in Exodus chapter 9 verse 23, in the plague of hail when he said, Fire ran along upon the ground. In verse 6, God is depicted standing and measuring the land, because it belongs to him, he is the owner. So, he measures it in order to divide it as he pleases. And everyone who tried to stand against him, whether it was mountains, nations, hills or heights, all were collapsed and had to bow finally to him. In verse 7, he talks about 2 countries which were terrified of God and his people. The first is Cushan, which is Cush, or Ethiopia located south of Egypt. Due to its proximity to Egypt, it was terrified of God and of his work, despite its greatness at that time. The second country he mentions is Midian, which met the people on their way to the promised land. It was terrified like the rest of all countries, and this is clear from the story mentioned in the book of Numbers chapter 22. When the Midian elders allied with Balak, king of Moab, and hired Balaam to curse the people. Habakkuk in verse 8 shows us that there is nothing that can stand before the people whom God is their God. He mentions 2 great challenges in the history of the Israelites. The Jordan River when he stood against the people before entering Canaan. And how Jordan fled before him. And the Red Sea, when it was parted and became a way for God's people to cross through it after their escape from Egypt. In verse 9, a beautiful verse shows God uncovering his bow, taking it out of its sack. And the arrows of God have an assured effect, because they are guaranteed by the authority of his word, which must be fulfilled. Whether it was promises to his people, or threats to his enemies. In verse 10 we see God's influence on nature. The mountains trembled. And the waves lifted up their hands on high, as if they were announcing their surrender, picturing what happened in parting the Red Sea. Reaching verse 11, we find God's miraculous intervention for the benefit of his people. When Joshua needed more time to conquer his enemies, God commanded the sun to stand still and continue the hours of the day. Here he talks about the soldiers of Israel as the flying arrows of God. In verse 12 we see God the leader who advances and guarantees victory. And in verse 13, the defeat of the enemy is made clear as a crushing defeat. And this is for the benefit of his anointed people. The blow was from the foot up to the neck, crushing the enemy's head. Indeed, it has a direct application to Pharaoh. And a future application on Satan himself, fulfilling God's promise to Eve. He will crush your head, Genesis chapter 3 verse 15. In verse 14, the enemy is portrayed as a hurricane whose aim is to scatter and annihilate God's people. Their wish was to devour the oppressed in secret. But God intervened and turned their arrows against them. So, their own arrows were the cause of their demise. This part concludes with verse 15, in which a third depiction of parting the Red Sea is given. We see God's people not fleeing from Pharaoh, but walking in confidence, walking in the midst of water, which turned into a wall, on their right hand, and on their left. For God makes a way for his people in the most difficult circumstances. As we come to the third part from verses 16 to 19, we find the final victory of Habakkuk's faith. Although the circumstances have not changed yet, and the enemies are still in control. Habakkuk says, I heard, and my inner parts trembled. At the sound, my lips quivered. Decay enters my bones. Affected by the horror and greatness of the previous scenes. This is what will give him rest in the day of trouble, that day when Babylon will invade Israel with his troops, to take them captive. Rest in the day of trouble, because he is certain of God's final salvation. He describes the state of devastation that occurred as a result of the Babylonian attack. The fig tree does not blossom, there is no fruit on the vines, the yield of the olive fails, and the fields produce no food. The flock disappears from the fold, and there are no cattle in the stalls. But still, there is who remains. The Lord, the God of his salvation. And that what made him capable of triumphing and saying, Yet I will triumph in the Lord, I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he has made my feet like deer's feet, and has me walk on my high places. So the feet of Habakkuk became as strong as the feet of a deer, which enables him to walk on his high places and the difficulties that face him. The chapter ends with instructions for the choir director, to be sung on stringed instruments. And we find how Shigionoth turned into praise at the end. Not because of salvation or circumstances changes, but because of the God of salvation. Here ends chapter 3, and the book of Habakkuk.